Okay, coming to the post-scientific period, um, which is roughly after the two physicists' work. So you could say late um, late 19th century, in other words, late 1800s to early 19th century or early 1900s, early 20th, sorry, late 19th to early 20th century. This is a time when people started studying human mind systematically. Um, and there were several different perspectives on how to study human mind. There are two things what made these different schools of thought differ from one another, and even now we can kind of trace back the methodology we adapt now to these different schools of thoughts. The idea is this: these schools of thought differed in terms of what they thought was appropriate to study human mind scientifically, and what method they thought was um, um, most appropriate, an objective way to collect information and to study human mind. What and how? What should we study and how should we study were the two main, at a very basic level, things that differentiated one school of thought from the other. And these were the earliest schools of thought. I mean, there were no scientific studies before this, at least not that we know of. The modern psychology is very much a product of, you can see still, now the earlier perspectives and their roots and how they evolved, and basically it's a continuation or a different version of these first schools of thought. And we look at the two most influential ones from that time. Um, One is the structuralism and the other one is functionalism. Let's first talk about structuralism. So structuralism, although the name itself was not given at the time, if I remember correctly, um, was founded by William Wundt in Germany. And this is, sorry, William Wundt in Germany. He is the psychologist who established the first psychological laboratory in Germany, in Leipzig, in the year 1879. And often the year 1879, for the same reason, is often referred to as the birth year of psychology in general. And of course, because it's a birth year, William Wundt is often referred to as the father of psychology in general. And this, again, in terms of the methodology and the thing that should be studied, well, the topic of study, according to Wundt, was it should be consciousness. Whatever we are consciously aware of, we should study that. And the method he adopted was called introspection. So introspection is the methodology and consciousness is the topic. Now, and in general, there's a story about what this, how Wundt, as a school kid, used to just stare and daydream and start thinking about things. Well, some say that maybe that helped him to select consciousness as a topic of study when he established this first laboratory in psychology. And because he used to introspect or reflect on his own thoughts, introspection was a methodology he adopted. Well, who knows? But at least we can kind of remember this information by using this as a context. Well, in a typical experiment, those days in Wundt's laboratory, participants would be presented by objects like these. And participants were trained actually to describe the impressions of this object without taking its name, without giving name to any of its features. So they need to talk about its color, shape, texture, and feeling. So you would say round, shiny, red, as opposed to apple. Or it's not necessarily visual. People used to sniff something and describe the feelings as they experience them. So the idea was whatever consciously you are experiencing, and if you can break that conscious experience into its individual components, um, um, that will really help you to understand how the mind gives us the uh, collective experience based on the individual components. It's more like the idea of knowing the atomic structure of all the physical objects in the world, right? So also the consciousness is like an object, and Wundt was trying to figure out the individual atoms of conscious experience. Again, this is just an analogy. So he was interested in determining the rules that gives us consciousness. How do we go from these individual components to this bigger combined experience? Now, there were two especially renowned students who later on actually popularized Wundt's work. One of them was Tishner. Um, and remember, Wundt's work was mostly in German, and hardly any other English-speaking nations had access to German literature or had expertise to actually uh, um, read these. So Tishner actually, with another student, they actually, Tishner, you would say, popularized or spread Wundt's work in English-speaking nations. He brought to the U.S. He was a student of Wundt. He brought structuralism to the U.S. And the name itself, the structuralism, if you can see, it's about the structure of the human consciousness, about the structure of the mind. So that's why it's called structuralism, because you're trying to determine the individual components associated with the structure of human mind. So it is referred to as structuralism. So the other student was Stanley Hall. In fact, he was the first student who worked at the laboratory, and he had a really significant contribution. Especially, he's known for things like in 1979 is the year that Wood established a psychological laboratory, and he was the first student, right? Stanley, he himself established a psychological laboratory in the U.S. That was the first psych lab in the U.S. at Johns Hopkins. He also founded what is now called as the American Psychological Association in 1892 and served as its first president. Well, he played a really key role in the development of psychology as a scientific field in the US. Yet, you'll see that he's not referred to as the father of American psychology. Rather, William James is referred to as the father of American psychology. We'll talk about more in a second about William James. Now, so the second school of thought at that time was called functionalism. And while the structuralism was founded by a German scientist, functionalism was founded by an American scientist. In fact, William James was a medical doctor, and you can imagine, because he was a doctor and was interested in healing people. His idea was to study the functions of the human behavior, or the purpose of the human behavior, and not the structure of it. Everything that the mind can do and does has some function to it, has a purpose to it, and so according to him, it's not the structure that scientists should study of human mind. Rather, it is the function of the human mind that they should study. So you can imagine, like, he was influenced by a Darwinian idea of how environment changes. And then this, you can connect the same thing to the Confucius idea of the role of environment in changing human behavior. Our behavior adapts, and every behavior has some ecological or evolutionary importance to it. And understanding that, according to him, should be the topic of psychology. So if you look at it, we discussed pre-scientific, scientific, post-scientific. Now we need to get back to the modern era, where we'll talk about um, behaviorism, gestalt psychology, psychoanalysis, and cognitive psychology.